So I and two others working at Theatr Cydiawr, Rona McLeod and sorry, McDougall, and we both wanted to put a conference on in order to give artists and companies an opportunity, as well as funders and everyone working in theatre, in the minority languages, Scottish and Irish, Gaelic and Welsh, to come together. And we organised that with support from Marianne Nichineja in NUI Galway, and also with support from Colm Cille. So that is Céal Dolen 1, which happened last year in Glasgow. We also were working in many different ways on collaborative projects, and the main project that we did between Ireland and Scotland was Scotties, that was its name, and it struck me how important the themes are that appear in this piece. So today, I and Pamela McQuinn will be talking about that project and using Scotties as a sort of model. We shall ask questions and talk about it, what we learned from it, and we learned about dramaturgy. A little context about Scotties itself. We had a commission from the National Theatre of Scotland, and we were also working with support from Áirithint na Mainteoireachta in Dublin, the Abbey, the National Theatre of Ireland. And the aim we had initially was that the two languages, Irish and Scottish Gaelic, would be involved, but also that the two countries would be linked through the story. We were aiming at crew and cast and a technical crew, creative crew, with half from Scotland and half from Ireland. And that's what we did. And also with the story itself, it's as based in Scotland and in Ireland, based on a true story about a fire disaster that happened 1956 in Kirkintilloch in Scotland. And unfortunately, 10 young boys died between 13 and 23 years of age, and they were working as potato pickers. They were migrant workers that came over from Mayo over to Scotland for work, and that happened often. People from Donegal did the same thing, and this disaster happened one night. They were locked in from outside, and the girls were next door. They were safe. The story struck me as I read more about it. I read the telegram from that the government in Ireland sent, and it's just said, "Bring home our dead." They just wanted the boys brought back to their own island. So the story was very heavy, very serious, very important. There were not many people who knew that story in Scotland. And it struck me how important it was that people in Scotland should know about what happened, but also how suitable this story was for the present day, because we all understood about the crisis where many migrant workers and refugees coming to our country on boats, and the terrible pictures that appear in the headlines again and again. So although it's not Irish people that are in this crisis in the present day, we knew that there were other young boys in that kind of trouble. And that's the reason I began to write along with a Francis poet. And we wrote two timelines, one based in 1936 and the other in the present day. Young boys were learning Gaelic in Glasgow, and the young girl in 1936 spoke Irish, as the squads from that area did at the time. And Scotty was the name that they called themselves, showing you something about their identity, the sense of identity, and the link between Scotland and Ireland, and how difficult it was that they worked so hard, and how proud they were about that connection. There's a pipe band in the island in Ireland, and the last thing was the officer that was given in this 17th century. I come from myself, and I was brought up with this prophecy that the first and last train would be full of the bodies of the dead, and that turned out to be true, and that was also woven into the play. So Phelim, could you show us the first clip now? So here we have a piece from the rehearsals that we had. Many thanks.
Yes, just...
Are we okay, Phelim? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yep. With me one moment.
So Shaw rehearsals.
So here we have the rehearsals that we did, and you can see Pamela.
Next to speak to her after the video. Yeah, and here we go.
This play is about a young Glaswegian boy coming of age and
can't see anything, Phelim.
His culture and his language means to him.
Sorry, guys.
That's okay.
Bear with me one moment.
That's okay. So I should explain that Pamela, just while we're waiting, Pamela McQueen is an amazing dramaturg. So Need in a High.
She's in Ireland, and she was working in Scotland at that time.
This play is about a young Glaswegian boy coming of age and finding out what his culture and his language means to him.
What do you mean you can't remember the last bit of the prophecy?
Are they hounding you with homework again?
Well, actually, I think I may have cracked it this time, Gran.
He discovers some truths about a part of Scotland's history. A tragic fire happened in Kirkintilloch where 10 young lads lost their lives.
Two parallel storylines. We've got 1937, which is based on true events, and then we've got a contemporary story of the family, I guess.
And he unearths that story.
It's a language in itself, so it adds this fourth layer essentially to the other three languages that are being spoken. Different elements that can enhance and represent what's happening both in the show but also what's happening for the characters.
Hopefully something that people can kind of view and think all those things are still alive.
She rud cutmach a hanna geld an alapag cutach an anédin agus a sinna children go máhaite a scéalach son féin hadish mar a ha na dúine fedachkins mar a ha scéalach go glósit.
They're not things that sit in history books.
Beautiful.
Many thanks.
Pamela, could you turn on your camera and your mic and I'll introduce you. That last shot was actually Shay Mo Fewish. That's my little sister playing the harp there at the end. She composed the score and music for the piece. And in that piece, you also saw Jessica Kennedy, who choreographed from Junk Ensemble, an Irish choreographer who was amazing. And she worked on the choreography, and Pamela will get into that a little bit later. I'd like to introduce the hero of the day. Pamela came in at a point where we had a development draft, really, in all honesty, that Frances and I had written. And I knew this was the first play I'd ever written, that I would need a huge amount of support to get it to anywhere near what it needed to be. And that support came in the form of the most excellent Pamela McQueen. So Pamela, would you like to fill us in just where you started on the project and a little bit about the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, what I received when I started working with you was the development draft. So a lot of the play was there in terms of plot, in terms of sort of the actions and the events, which you were pretty clear about. And of course, you knew that you were sort of investigating and honouring the Kirkintilloch tragedy. So that was, all of that was there. I think some of it that wasn't clear was sort of the structure of the storytelling. And so just in terms of that process and what the amount of work that we did, just so people can get a feel of it, there were 3 full redrafts of the play done between us over those few months that we had before rehearsals. And within that, then there were a couple of particular scenes that we reworked specifically, which I'll get into later. And then interestingly, we had kind of markers for what we were calling the visual score, which I'll come back to as well. But so that meant that when we went into the rehearsal room, although our text was very kind of tight and we're very clear in terms of what the dramatic dialogue was doing, we still continued editing in relation to that merging of the meaning and the communication of the visual score with the text and merging those two things together. So just in terms of that's the kind of the transition of working through to get to the final draft or prompt copy that went up on the stage, you know. So yeah, I suppose going back to the beginning, how do you get there? So in terms of the first thing we did, and it's interesting looking back over the notes now at some distance, is we actually, if you remember this, went right back into character. So we had what we knew, particularly in the 1936 storyline, that plot line, and then the family and how they were going to end up interacting with it. But the first thing we went, and especially in relation to language, was putting this into a lived experience of history and therefore working through character. And obviously there's certain things you ask yourself about character in any given play. You know, you're looking at the idiolect of each individual character, that personalized stew of how and what they speak. And when you get into 3 languages, that's particularly interesting because you're looking at what is that moment in history that allows them to access that language. So in a way, particularly, I'd say possibly maybe looking at the Gaeilge Burla one back in the 1930s timeline, how, for example, this is the question, I asked a lot of questions, as you remember, Muireann, but the question I would have kept on asking you was, how do you access English out of a Gaeltacht area at the time, a purely Gaeltacht area? Mm-hmm. And so there then comes into play with different characters, who has access to English, at what level do they have it? And then what does that mean for the relationships and the status within the ACL community and within the actual Scotties working group community? So each of those characters, you know, we work through a character book, if you like, and the character bios. And so the language, those questions around the language, kind of dug into what was the socioeconomic status of each character. You know, what was the reasons why they could speak certain things, you know. And so we built up stories around characters for that as well. So Molly, who is the young girl, has a brother who has been a Scottie for several years, and this is her first time coming out. So she exists solely in Gaeilge because she has no access really except for through her brother, who then had semi-access to English. But there was only actually one person, I think, who was completely bilingual coming from that grouping. So in a way, like you, I mean, it is literally that technical at times, that you have a sheet and you have characters and what languages they have access to and can speak. And in terms of flipping that into the present day timeline, it was quite different in terms of what you were working with in your characters, because, well, you would have mainly, there you had the Gaelic and you had English mostly, although a little bit of Gaeilge came through the family history, but it was mainly those 2 languages. And for those 2, it was a question of how do you access the Gaelic in a way, and then that came through Gaelic in Glasgow today in a contemporary society through family, coming down through the family, and then also if you have the Gaelic education as well. So when you dug into those characters, it was actually about kind of an emotional landscape through the family and through heritage. And then this was the unifying factor, in a sense, between those larger themes of history and how you inherit your history on a personal way, and what that means for the language, like how you inherit your original native language and what kind of weights come with that. Because in the 1930s timeline, the weight that comes with that Gaelic is, of course, quite tragic, and particularly in the case of your character Molly, which was a survivor of a tragedy. And so you get into something else, which is when you get into the lived experience of history, the heritage within the language of the emotional weight of it. So that's a PTSD situation that you're dealing with, and an actual piece of trauma, you know.
And we talked a lot about the trauma that was passed down. It's trauma that's still felt in Achill, whether it's recognised or not to this day. And actually you could see that when I forgot to say, we toured it in Scotland and then took it to Achill with support from the Abbey. And you could see that it was like it had a feeling of at times awake when people came, and you could feel the scar that's still in that island. And just when you're speaking about how we built up almost validation for the different characters to be able to speak or access these languages, the thing that I always came back to was Michael's character, the young lad from Glasgow. I had a young lad that age who was 13 at the time. He's now big and hairy. But at that time, both myself and my sister, who actually lives in Achill, had 13-year-old boys, and it was not lost on me when we'd see them walking down by the beach, how lucky they were and how this was not happening to them, but also in creating Michael's character, how he became our investigator, how he unearthed the plot for us, and in doing so discovered his connection with Gaelic.
And there's also a kind of a richness in that, you know, because I mean, that's the basic starting point in a way, but then as you're drafting, as you're going through these several drafts, you know, you're working with that within each scene, in each character relationship. So there's moments of there were moments of great levity in the play where people were turning, you know, the lack of understanding of a particular language back on another character, you know. And then there was also moments where it became more serious about the not being able to access a piece of essential knowledge, you know, and that would be the Tatty Hokers not being able to access some of the English information, you know. So it becomes that the question of the semantic knowledge within the language becomes then part of the plot line as well. It becomes part of the exposition. And I suppose then just getting into the actual sort of the mechanics of the writing, the thing you're trying to avoid all the time is to have triple exposition. So like people telling you what is happening essentially in the plot, not once, which is, you know, bad enough in any play, you know, just to have to be told and not shown, but 3 times, you know. So this was something that, like, in every draft as we went through, you're constantly sort of guarding against, really, if you're honest, to make sure that it's not just a constant telling, it's also a showing. And so that's, I think, being really conscious of that, working with the languages, is also where this conversation developed about this visual dramaturgy within the play, which was really essential. So obviously with 2 timelines, one of my earliest and biggest questions is how do you move between them? And you were quite clear from the beginning that something that there was going to be some doubling in the casting, and it meant that actors were going to create a kind of movement sequence to move between those 2 timelines. And once you had kind of brought that up, it then grew into sort of a language in its own right, through the music, through the scenography, and through the actual movement itself. And so what was particularly good for, I think, was in the 1930s section, where there was a lot more Gaeilge than Berla, and also I would have been aware that going in front of Scottish audiences, that was going to be pretty inaccessible. So that lived experience of what it meant to be a Tatty Hawker was actually shown on stage through that movement. So early on, we had these placeholders. I don't know if you remember this. We had these placeholders in the script where we had written things like, "This is the work song," where we see them actually lifting the ground.
Yeah.
Or we had.
Actually, Pam, do you want me to run that clip just now of Phelan, would you mind running the video, the second video? Because I think seeing it and then hearing you talk about the visual and the score physically will make a bit more sense.
Yeah.
Is that okay, Phelan? Great. Is Scotty, Nick?
You're Scotty.
Agus ha sé curí sé cholach digitáliste tína go hásta?
Mum, have you lost it? Our Cantella has never held anything for us. We're not wanted here. Bad luck doesn't need any help here.
Who's trapped? I don't know what you're talking about.
Thanks, Phelan. Yeah, so as it all come flooding back, I just noticed in the chat there, Muireann Ní Ghráinne said she saw Scotties in Achill. So yeah, I mean, the notion of them, these casts both being double cast, but also merging into a chorus, and that score of the aids for different audiences at different times. So the physical and the music and the sound score helping at another level is really important.
The sounds, that score that you're talking about in the 1930s was really important, and you can kind of catch a little element of it within what you just showed there in terms of kind of tone, energy, and the emotion of it, you know. So it was doing, in a sense, a lot of heavy lifting for that, because what we felt, and I think it is very true to say, is that the kind of language that the characters were able to use in 2018 about their own emotions, self-awareness and psychology was not available in the same way in the 1930s. And so a lot more of, you know, what it felt, the difficulties of that life, you know, the lonelinesses, the homesickness, things like that were being shown a lot more through some of the songs and through the kind of, through the movement as well, you know. And even that section, I don't know if it's quite clear there, there's a section where they're kind of on a table and they're moving, and that was actually relatively long, it was a whole scene, and that was actually that sort of migratory, transitory nature of they were constantly traveling as well. So that sense of the displacement, you know. So yeah, I think it was really important to kind of show a lot of that, but that also feeds into kind of another like overarching question that we were sort of using as we were working through the drafting process is, you know, you are showing people who experience this extreme tragedy, and how are you going to kind of stage that in a kind of ethical and respectful manner, but also show the impact. And there's a crucial part in the middle where the two sort of storylines come together, where you understand what's happened with Molly. Molly has survived this, and you see her in a kind of almost catatonic state of the extreme shock, and she's non-verbal for a period of the play and has to kind of be brought back to herself. And really what's so key about that section is that that's the inheritance that then travels down through the generations into the family in Glasgow in 2018, you know. So yeah, so just in terms of what the story was talking about as well, you had this other element as we worked through it, which was this kind of ethical representation of a very kind of difficult period of history and what that meant as it traveled down through the generations. And the key part was that this, of course, was what broke the chain of language. So ultimately that character in this story, and this is kind of what I mean about the character Bibles. This was all in the character Bibles. Did not stay on Achill, and in fact was the original permanent immigrant into Scotland, you know, that created that family line that we were then meeting in the present day. And that trauma created a kind of a severance when she couldn't cope with that, the severance from Ireland in emigration, and the split away from that culture meant the loss of the language as well. So
yeah, and also there were ethical implications, just even in terms of right from the start. You know, we were very clear we weren't making a documentary. Teacher Cahir had already done that with Ardóver Féin. So, but we were also aware that we were basing this on, well, one part of the storyline on that. And we had spent a lot of time in both Achill and Kirkintilloch collecting information and interviewing people, some of whom were related to these victims. So there's a much bigger ethical question just as soon as you start to work with something as sensitive as this. And I have to say, one of the scenes you saw in the clip there, the Cayley scene, was one of the few times that we had a chance to bring a lightness and to show the joy.
Yeah.
And the community, and that is so strong in any migrant community, but we needed a counterpoint, and that provided that. But yeah, ethically it was a challenge to make sure we stayed respectful and sensitive to how we approached it. So,
and I think that kind of played into something as well from the beginning, where it took a long time, as I recall, for you to kind of decide what the ending was be, as in the meaning of the ending, because you had this idea that the contemporary family would return to Achill, but there wasn't really a larger context around that about what it would mean. And it took a long time to work that through, actually, because, you know, there was the questions around, like, is it possible to have a resolution, you know, and a reunifying of these different kind of cultural inheritances, and it felt, and I remember you writing kind of versions of that and kind of skimming around the edge of that, and it felt for a long time like it didn't work, because we kind of pat a resolution to just go, oh, and it'll all be fine now, because, you know, we looked at that instant in the past and that's just everything sorted, and we can all get Duolingo and learn the languages and bada boom, you know. So there was kind of a compromise ultimately on that ending, that there was the ending became the possibility of a beginning, the possibility of maybe a reunion, maybe not, but that there had been a kind of an embracing of something that had been hidden before. There had been a light thrown on the darkness. You know? Yeah,
and an embrace, I suppose, just to bring in some of the stuff that Arwell mentioned earlier in the week. He spoke about agents of change, and he spoke about, the local, highlighting, using the local to highlight the universal. And actually that's where we went in the end. We went to all those things I felt watching those two boys standing, my boys standing in Achill, and actually it's not them anymore. We went to a much bigger, we embraced a much bigger issue, which, you know, there's always them and us, there's always outsiders. So rather than it, as you say, we're done and dusted, there were many endings. But that felt the most important ending, because that was us acknowledging the now and the situation now. And yeah, I mean, at the time, just to put this in context, 6,000 people lined the quays in Dublin when these boys were brought back home. Their bodies were brought home. People lined every station all the way down to Achill to pay their respects. This was massive. And it was highlighting really the failings of the Irish government to deal with the problems of migrant workers, but also it was highlighting the really difficult situation for Irish, particularly Catholics in Scotland at that time, and the conditions they were working at. And also just more generally, there were huge activists working, particularly came out of Donegal at the time, highlighting how difficult those working situations were for in the bothies, and they were literally sleeping in cowsheds. And I suppose the ending really was about, you know, who are those people now, and that young boy in Glasgow recognising all his culture, all he'd been given, but also that this was not him now. There was an element of that universal that helped tell the ending, I think. I'm just looking at the time. Pamela, what have we not covered that you want to talk about in terms of the dramaturgical process? So I'll give you another hour.
Sorry, yes. So I suppose just when I mentioned about that we reworked a couple of scenes a lot.
Yeah.
That certainly the ending would have been one. And the other one would have been the representation of the actual death itself, if you like, of those 10 boys. And again, in that clip you would have seen the raising up of the body and the carrying of it. And this is the disembarkation, if you like, back home at Achill of the coffins. And like, I have to say, it took a long time to get to that, because ultimately it felt too difficult to just sort of narrate that through language. That you come back to this notion of the idea of embodying things. The other thing I'd say is that we haven't kind of talked about, we talk about the language internally, which in the narrative itself, but there is this thing that you have to do, and you have to do on every single draft and every single rewrite and every moment, is also ask yourself the question is, this is what the characters mean, this is what the drama means, but what do the audience actually hear? What is it possible, if you don't have, surtitles or whatever, what is it possible for the audience to hear? And so a lot of the actual linguistic structure, the actual sentences and everything, we really pushed really hard to bring emotion and expression through the language, so that even if you couldn't get each semantic meaning of the words, what you could get was the tonal and emotional quality, and also that stage picture that we were talking about. So that was the kind of backup, that was the kind of fallback for you only knowing one language kind of thing. And then, that final thing at the very end, where I think that we, even still with all our care, I think we were kind of overcompensating at certain times about the absolute, we identified about sort of 12 key kind of plot points or character points of information that were absolutely essential to know, to be able to follow A to Z in the drama.
Yeah.
And so I think we probably slightly overcompensated on those particular 12 points in the writing. And that's where, when we went into the rehearsal room, with the benefit of the wonderful choreography of Jessie Kennedy, and indeed the music from Leisha, it meant that, and of course Charlotte's design, the beautiful gauzes, which I probably don't have time to talk about, it meant that we could actually then pull back on some of those overemphasis, because we realized that the production was supporting some of those points along the way. So probably of all the work I've done, actually, it's where we have small edits, in scene, not large chunks, but small edits within the scene. In the first 2 weeks of rehearsal, it's probably where I've done the most of that. Mm-hmm. But I do think that what was crucial in making that rehearsal period work is that we never had to go back and really restructure anything or look at the narrative. So we could really give a huge amount of time to that movement, dance, score, and that integration, Yeah,
I'm really sorry we're out of time. So there was a quick question from Sam asking about the role the Scots played. Phelim, can you line up the last video for us? And I'll just, while I'm talking about this, that'd be great. So Liz Lockhead wrote the adaptation of the Scots piece we used in the middle. Whenever you're ready.
It's great. I loved it. I'm moved, and I don't understand all the languages, but I understood what was happening.
It's beautiful, really beautiful, and the girl who plays Molly is just outstanding.
Oh, it was brilliant. Like, honestly, it was so good.
Emotional.
I cried so much,
I was absolutely overwhelmed by it because, can I tell you, it was stunning.
Really, really good. I was really interested in how they use the different languages, the English and the Irish and the Gaelic. Now, I don't speak Irish, and so I didn't immediately know the difference, but you could tell from the story.
I thought it was excellent.
Yeah, it was
really, really engaging with the characters. Really, really great portrayals, some brilliant performances.
I feel very moved, and I'm kind of finding it hard to talk, and it's just so nice to hear Irish and Gaelic spoken together.
Rúta each no goals get a miolch in scéalach the dechtri le hacket. Agus get a physic go the lessige gel of cluch chimical edition. Har physic kimmer a dollar yenu kel at a shin agus an la Jew. Achliche characterliche free of character shaw Michel. Hannig a hula hele as hannig and chachkerach gewys cool na scéalach tre ze faking Kersonnisht, Kersona High Kutramok Bishan Ginchik na scale like Sean Draste.
As someone who doesn't speak Gaelic or Gaelic and only understands English, I felt that they did it in such a way that it was clear to the audience, even if they didn't speak it. I felt that it was done with respect, and the music was amazing.
He'll make a lush grow and drama just arouse Gamai Simul, Dordi Shay, Alan Mohokan, Onum. Agus tam cinse go nnéine sé sin le lucht féicna ar bí agus sénta simú an bailach na chuir sé na teangacha le chéile agus cumáile sin gur rinn sé nasc idir an rud mar a tharla sé thart fa céad bliain ó hin agus na rudaí ag tar tarlús sa dahan sa lá tá nniuan so just bhí sé just stíreach ar aus sin é.
Thank you, Gurmil Magat. I think we've run a little bit over. I'd like to ask Arwell and Darach Macanumra to turn their cameras and their mics on, and I'll introduce you. Hi, Darach. Hi, Arwell. So yeah, we were using Scotties there really to kind of illustrate a couple of the challenges we faced and how dramaturgy plays a role in when you're dealing with more than one language. Can I ask you, Darach, I know recently you've been taken on a mammoth task, bringing together, you went all out. It wasn't just two languages. Actually, there was a piece of Scots which we, Liz Lockhead adapted for us in ours and also BSL in English. So technically we were up at about 4 or 5. But I think in fairness, you're top of the Premier League there when you're trying to bring all these languages together. Would you like to just tell us a little bit about Oro? I know Ali and Gaeltacht, they're very proud of what you did, and obviously we were gutted not to be able to see it.
Thanks and congratulations on Scotties. It's actually funny, one of the pipers in Scotties was actually Lana. She came on board with Oro as a production assistant, and then found out that she actually played the pipe, so she actually ended up in the show as well. I was asked maybe a year and a half ago by Ali and Gaeltacht to come on board to bring this show together. It started out as an idea of bringing 5 Irish or Gaeltacht-based artists across multidisciplinary artists, visual artists, dancers, writers, poets, whatever, musicians, and to pair them with 5 artists from regions in Friesland, Wales, Alban, Cornwall, and the Basque Country. And so initially it was designed to have them working in pairs all around Connemara and Galway region as part of the Galway 2020 European Capital Culture Project. So I kind of went, I was kind of imagining if I was asked as an artist to go away from my home, my family for a certain amount of time and to partner with one other person and to create a work with them, not knowing who that person is, I'd be kind of nervous and apprehensive and be kind of going like, what's, you know, there's a minefield there because it's like a marriage, like it's a relationship, it's a great relationship. And I believe the key thing for any successful collaboration is a want and a desire to see a common vision. And I think this sometimes goes down like a lead balloon when I say this on conferences like this, but I don't believe language is enough to drive the collaboration. I think it needs to be broader than that, and it has to come from story and from what we want to say. In my view, creating art for the sake of the language doesn't excite me personally. I'm very passionate about Gaeilge. I'm bringing my children up with Gaeilge, do you know what I mean? But I try to separate that as much as possible from my work. So anyways, so I think this had to be driven by the work, and I think if we can get artists that come together that are inspired by a single or a common vision, that if you have that, you will succeed. If you don't have that, you'll be forcing it, and if you're forcing it, you have a problem. So anyways, instead of putting the pressure on the two of them, we said, well, what if we brought the 10 artists together in one room and made something on a bigger scale? And also we were making one event instead of making 6 or whatever, 5 different events. So basically we pooled everything. So we said we'd do that. So we brought, I then basically brought artists together from the different regions, countries, and then we didn't know what we were going to do. We knew we were going to do it in a factory in Connemara for 1 week, about 8 performances in September. And this was July 2019, so September 2020. So we had a year, 20 months to do it. And basically, we were to come together for Development Week in April, another Development Week in May, in the space together to figure out what we wanted to do, and then go away and then come back in August and rehearse and put it together. So it's a devised piece, so it put me completely out of my comfort zone, which is narrative structure and script, and I'm a writer, and I like, sort out the structure like Pam was talking about, and then rehearse it and do it. So this is completely upside down for me. I had to go in, I didn't have a script, I didn't write it. I usually only direct the work I write. So it was a huge leap and a huge learning for me. But the artists involved were great. So yeah.
Can you remind us, Darach, what countries were involved again? And
it was Alban. It's supposed to be Alban, Vrattenberg, Cymru, Cornwall, and Friesland in northern Holland, and the Basque Country. So basically, we had a painter and a musician and a poet from Friesland, Anna Fedema. And then he's a brilliant, amazing painter. And then we had Josie, actually Kathleen McInnes was supposed to be with us from Alban, and then she couldn't do it at the end. So Josie Duncan came on board from Alban, beautiful singer and musician. And then we had Kizzy Crawford was to be with us from Vrattenberg from Wales, but actually at the last minute she couldn't go. She had health difficulties. We created this actually in COVID. Do you know what I mean? Like actually, what saved us?
I know, that's what I was going to say. What pulling this off at any given time is a mammoth feat. Pulling it off and having to deal with this through the lockdown and the pandemic is just unbelievable.
We're lucky, but everybody was like, actually worked. I think what Lara was talking about as well, and a few of them as well, we're talking about actually since the lockdowns come, we all obviously realised the need we have for art, and actually it was actually a saving grace for all of us. I think everybody who was creatively involved and otherwise involved with Oro. Really, it came at an amazing time for us on a kind of mental health point of view, because we had an outlet. Everybody else was shut down, all the theatres were shut down, and suddenly we had this amazing, like once in a lifetime kind of opportunity where we had a very considerable budget, amazing artists, and a blank canvas to do whatever it is we wanted. And obviously with all of this comes huge, an onus to actually deliver. But we had no committee to tell us what we could do or couldn't do. We had no script, which is terrifying for me, but we had an amazing kind of buy-in. And because so instead of those first 2 weeks of development, we couldn't actually physically, we were to bring the artists to Connemara, they couldn't do so. We actually were on Zoom. So there's a heap of us on Zoom for 2 weeks, Monday to Friday, getting to know each other, trying to talk about what we might do, what we mightn't do. So we started with what we wanted to avoid. But it was then trying to connect, get people. It was really frustrating because you had amazing musicians, amazing artists, amazing visual artists, amazing writers, etc., and poets online, but you can't even sing a song together. You can't actually play a tune together. There's a latency. So it's it's tantalizing. But that said, so anyways, we did 2 weeks on Zoom, and they actually saved us, because by the time then restrictions lifted and they could come, all the artists could come here in August, in early August. So we had to bring artists in early, self-isolate for 2 weeks, pay them for 2 weeks. So 10 artists, an extra 2 weeks.
Well, you had that big budget.
Oh, honest to God, like Jim was saying, like I think it was nearly it was the mid 30,000, it was over 30,000 euro the COVID cost us, do you know? Anyway, it was. I know we might do you want to Phelim, just to give a visual representative, because I know when you're talking about things in a do you want to either will I show the video or do you want to show the photos, Phelim, or the photos maybe? This is the warm up before the show started. This isn't and these are anyways. So yeah, we had a very, very big space. So we were all wearing masks. So an interesting.
Is it a warehouse?
It's a warehouse. It's a massive warehouse in Carrow. So that's about a tenth of it.
Right. Okay. So social distancing, not a problem.
Not a problem. We were temperature checking everybody coming in. We were COVID testing everybody regularly. 2 meter distance for rehearsals. So before we did anything, and it's a devised piece. It's a very physical piece. So before we actually did anything, we had to figure out how we would do it. Certain people were very, very, very uptight about the COVID thing naturally, and other people were very laissez-faire about it. We kept everybody in pods, everybody in, I mean, it was tough for people going back to their families and then basically in accommodation. So yeah, it was, but it actually, in a way, it brought a huge, that's Amaya Eliza, and there's an interesting question here. She's in the Basque Country. She's an absolutely amazing contemporary dancer. I might show you a clip now very briefly of her. But an interesting question there is, this was all on Zoom, but like there was no Basque in the show, but there was a Basque contemporary dancer. So discuss, you know, in terms of funding, do you know, I mean, would you, as a funding agency, sending your artist over, because that was discussed from the Basque funding agency, will there be Basque? It says, well, you know, we're not going to force a language into the show for the sake, we said reverse engineer it, like we're going to, you know, so anyway, I might just give you maybe 30 seconds of a video clip if we have time, but if we don't.
And then we'll come to Arwell, because Arwell's not really had a chance to fill us in on all the wonderful collaborations he does in Wales.
Great.
Oh, it looks fab.
No, this isn't graded or this is very well.
Wow, that was great. That's the great Liam Mwele, and I recognise the Basque. I worked with a Basque singer, a bit like the Portuguese fado. That I love that he was trying to marry that style. Just amazing. I'm going to rush you. I'm really sorry just to bring in Arwell here. Arwell, we're going to do this in 5 minutes. Could you just talk to us a little bit about the collaborations? I know you've done one with the Breton Company, and you touched on a international collaboration you did. Remind me again, I think you said you went to the Edinburgh Festival with a piece and it was picked up by the British Arts Council.
Yeah, sure. That was a Welsh language play, actually, although it had a smattering of English in it, not very much. I mean, what we did with that play, and we actually produced a sequel to that play 10 years on, which had to close due to COVID in March, when we were about to go on tour of Wales. Yeah, so look out for it when it comes back. It's called Tylwyth, and it's by Dave James. But it's in that work, there was one character in it who didn't speak Welsh, even though all the other characters did. But that character could actually understand Welsh, but not speak it. But the other characters tended to speak English to that character. So that we find that in doing that, it kind of just opens the door a little bit more to non-Welsh speakers, because sometimes when you read a lot of subtitles, it can be a bit tiresome. And actually, when there's a scene or part of a scene that's in English, it actually gives non-Welsh speakers a bit of a breather, and they go, "Oh, I don't have to read for this bit." And I think that that really does help. But yeah, that wasn't necessarily an international collaboration. It was just an international touring opportunity that we were able to grab.
All right. Okay.
No, yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
And then we did collaborate with the Breton company, as you said. That ended up being a multilingual piece where we avoided English, but included French and Creole as well. So it was. That was an interesting one, and actually that's going back to to what Darach was saying about the need for there to be something that everybody can feel equally passionate about, and for the piece not to be about the language, or that it's not just the language that brings people together. And I think that's a really valuable thought. And I think what you had in Scotties, actually you had a story there, you had a narrative around which all the languages could actually coalesce in a meaningful way. And I think that it was almost like the perfect story for that collaboration. I think.
Yeah, I think. I mean, totally. I mean, I agree. So this convention, and even the last convention, is really not about making pieces about the language, although sometimes that happens. I think most artists would always want their piece of art to stand on its own 2 feet, and actually that's how you bring life to the languages, just by telling those stories, whatever. So sorry, other than the Breton collaboration, have you been involved in other collaborations with other languages?
Yes, we've done some productions, of course, that have included English. We did one production that included English and Spanish, because it was about the migration of the Welsh colony or the establishment of the Welsh colony in Patagonia. So again, that gave sort of a meaningful frame to the multilingual aspect of that piece as well. I'm really interested in, and what we did in that piece as well was a little bit of what we saw in that last clip, and what we saw in Scotties as well is to take the multidisciplinary approach and to not actually depend too much on the spoken word, or go down the sort of the dialogue route, because therein much trouble lies in trying to convey aspects of the story. And although you can use subtitles, and we do on occasion where you have to actually to take that multidisciplinary approach to a multilingual piece or a multicultural piece, it's probably a more meaningful and rewarding one for everyone involved, including the audience.
Yeah, something we've not had a chance to touch on at all is the challenges of how you produce and fund these things. And I'm sure, Darach, you could probably talk for hours on the challenges of bringing that one together. Certainly, I would just say that I think sometimes it's difficult to bring a project, particularly a collaborative project, and try and justify it to the various countries that you're collaborating with. Sometimes, well, in our case, sometimes Scotties wasn't Scottish enough in Ireland, vice versa, and yeah, it can be a really challenge in terms of producing and funding. I think that is something that we probably could share best practice about and learn from each other.
I'll sum it up in one word: tenacity. To the power of 1,000,000. That's all you need. Just keep at it and don't let them off the hook, and keep bringing them and keep bringing them and keep bringing them.
I mean, we were working on Scotties for 10 years. There you go. That's tenacity. We managed to get 2 national theatres involved in the end. But yeah, for sure, I'm in total agreement. I'm going to, there we are, 11 o'clock. I'm not sure, Sam, if I answered your question enough about the Scots language. There was a small piece in that came from a researched character that I found in Kirkintilloch. And as I said, Liz Lockhead wrote the adaptation of that piece, and it was beautiful. It was really moving in Scots. Trying to see if anything else came in the feed there. So I think the next session we're going to move to after, the next session is one of the commissioned pieces, a Welsh one, and I'm going to get this completely wrong, it's Chris Harris, and I don't think I could even try this. The title of it is Beyond My Duolingo Stage 1 Welsh, so I'll let the piece speak for itself. I think he's going to do an introduction before it plays anyway, so yeah, diolch. Chris, and I'll hand you over to Phelim to start. There we go. Is that Chris? Hi, Chris. So I'll hand over to Chris. We'll all switch off our cameras and mics and let Chris introduce his piece. Okay, Chidi and Drast.
Diolch yn fawr, pawb. Thank you very much for being here. It's absolutely wonderful. It's a bit daunting, the fact I've been watching other people speak for ages and now I'm here on my own. Yeah, so the title of the piece this morning is called Ymyrraeth Harry, which means Harry's Intervention. And when the opportunity came up to create a piece for the festival, I thought a lot about what I had at my disposal in this really difficult time. And when starting to make the piece, Wales actually went into a national lockdown, so it became increasingly difficult to actually make a piece in any kind of grand capacity. But what was, of course, available to me was myself, what I experience, and also the environment that I live in. I live in Bridgend, which is in the south of Wales, about half an hour west of Cardiff. And it's I'm calling it an intervention because it's a kind of personal conversation that I have with my skin. Thank you very much. Yes, it's a conversation I have with my own skin and what it means to be an adult who lives with eczema. I believe there's about 43 people across the UK who live with the condition of eczema. An even smaller percentage of adults go on to live with it for the rest of their life from what we call atopic or chronic eczema. And I'm one of these people. And the thought behind it was, despite the hundreds of thousands of people who are in hospital beds across the world because of COVID-19 and other awful conditions and diseases, there are day-to-day struggles that I think each and every one of us are going through that we may not see. And so the reality is that we all have our own ways of surviving this pandemic and surviving our day-to-day lives. The only way for me to do that was to do it in a very comical way, which I think I have license to do because it's an intervention with myself in a way. And the intervention is something that I've gone through over the past year. I had a terrible time last year with my skin and having to go in and out of hospital to see the dermatologist, to see GPs, and going through all sorts of quack medication that just didn't work at all. And then I finally, in the end, managed to sit on something that's kind of worked with me and build a routine. But part of the reason that I've sort of got through that period was because it took the time for me to just sit down with myself and say, look, if you don't embrace this as part of you and not look at it as your enemy, then you'll never survive it. It's a part of you and it will always be a part of you. So the quicker that you learn that lesson, the better. So I think that's all I kind of want to say about it at the moment. I'm really excited for you to see it. I'll hang around afterwards, which I think is just put in the chat now. I'll hang around in the coffee break afterwards, and then if anybody wants to ask anything or know anything further about it, then please feel free to ask. So that's it. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr I chi. Gwranda. So ti'n hoffi fi, a sa'n hoffi ti chwaith. Gallen nhw mynd gyda cataracts gweld ein bod ni'n achosi problemau ein gilydd, ti'n mo? A mae rhaid i ni dechrau derbyn ein gilydd. Mae gyda ni llwybr mawr o fywyd i deithio yn blaenau, yn dos? Llaeth popeth o'i le. Dwi dal i droelli ar y cwestiwn hynna yn fy meddwl i. Fel gwleidyddwr allai sefyll yma a beio ti, a gallu ti beio fi, ac fyddwn ni mewn mwy o fes nag o'n i ar y cychwyn. Ond mae rhaid i ni dechrau derbyn ein gilydd. Fel de a gogledd Corea. Mae rhaid i ni cysylltu ein gilydd, checio mewn ein gilydd. Lle aeth popeth o'i le? Mi ddwedai wrth y ti. Chwedl dy hanes di yw dy fod i'n rhan o blentyndod ac nid fel oedolyn. Proffeswyd Immanuel Kant, dyma fo, a bod yna reality yn y byd a dydyn ni ddim yn gwybod amdano. Gawodd rhain yn nomenon sy'n gwahanol i ffenomenon, ddelfryd clirol reality fel y rydym yn adnabod. Rwy'n parablu ymlaen yn barod. Hynny yw, y nomenon yw'r gwirionydd ac nid beth mae pobl o reidrwydd yn ei weld o flaen nhw. Wel, dyna sut yn gyffredinol rwy'n teimlo am ein berthynas ni, ti'n mo? Nid yw pawb yn gweld y gwirionedd sydd o flaen nhw. Gweithygodd popeth yn mor gloi as mi fod yn blentyn. Un o'r ffigenwe ges ti yn yr ysgol oedd cornflakes. Ac yn ystod o haf, oedd y ti fel cig moch yn ffrio yn y pan tra bod pawb arall yn chwarae tu fas. Mae rhan fwyaf o blant yn mynd i'r arcade neu'r skatepark pan maen nhw'n 14 mlynedd oed, ond ges i'r ffawd o gael fynd i'r dermatologist, ac ffeindio nhw dim byd ar ôl wythnos o wisgo'r anghenfilod yma, sylweddolus fod patch testing ddim yn unrhyw beth i'w wneud gyda morladron, ac roedden yn barod i glyweliadu am The Matrix, yn enwedig pan dwedodd Dermastein y geiriau y fydd yn newid fy mywyd am fyth.
Get used to it, Harry, because you're going to be living with this for the rest of your life.
Ond fel dywedodd Robert Frost, the only way around is through. Ac nawr, fel oedolyn, hoffwn i ddweud fod ti wedi palu rhyw ffordd. Ond na, rwy ti dal yna. Bob nos yn rwystro fi rhag cysgu, yn troi ac yn symud tan bod dim diweddglo. Ac yn y bore, hanner y croen yn gorwedd yn y gwely fel neidyr ar ôl i mi adael. Gyda'r bore, mae'r gwely yn edrych fel y golygfa yna allan o Nightmare on Elm Street, pan mae Johnny Depp yn cael ei bwyta gan y gwely. Ond edrychus dros dy di yn do. Cetraben, moisturiser, ffrind gorau eczema, plus-sized ac wastad yna i ti. Humavate, steroid, wyneb a gwddf. Hydrocortisone, mild steroid, i'r wyneb yn bennaf. Ac yna Betnovate, major steroid, stealth mode yn bennaf. Ac yna cocktail o vitamin D, zinc ac antihistamines, one a day as needed. Pob un yn nhw yn gast o ffrindiau allan o'r American High School film. Ond fel oedolyn eiddfed, roeddes i routine i ti yn do. Nes i bron anghofio, trio ni fisgo paste bandages yn do. Ond edrychus i mwy fel Boris Karloff nag unrhyw beth arall. Ac yna, menig i bopeth a phopeth i fenig, yn edrych fel y maffia. Sdim alergydd gen ti, ond mae popeth yn weithygwr. Serch hynny, rydym yn byw mewn byd lle mae popeth yn cael ei arddangos. Rwy'n ysgoi unrhyw beth gyda croen yn y teitl. Ac yna daw'r misoedd oer i ymweld â ni. Dim ond ffwl sy'n byw gyda cyflwr fel ti sy'n ffeindio fod sefyll allan yn y tywydd rhewllyd yn paradwys. Ond mae'r un ffwl hefyd yn wybod fod tymhorau fel hyn yn chwarae hafoc arno ti. Pwy a oer o un ddydd i'r llall sut wyt ti yn mynd i ymateb? O, a gerllaw, dyw central heating ddim yn ffrind i ni yn ystod y gaeaf. Ond does neb yn y byd yn gallu rhwystro symudiadau y tymhorau achos yna, along came COVID-19, the not so much anticipated sequel to COVID-18, colli swyddi, colli feddwl.
mae'r straen yn cynyddu. Rwyf wedi gwrando I bob un awyrgylch o'r goedwig glaw sydd allan yna, ond bydd gorfod teithio o gwmpas y cylchred crafu unwaith eto.
Ie, clywys di'n iawn. Y cylched crafu.
OK, so beth yw'r cylchred crafu? Gad I mi ddangos yn union beth ydw i'n meddwl. Mae'r cylchred crafu yn gylchddiedlig iawn sy'n cychwyn gyda straen oherwydd gwaith, ymgylchedd, gres ac yn y blaen. Felly, rwy'n crafu, sy'n golygu wedyn mae o'n lludiog sy'n gwneud I mi crafu hyd yn oed yn fwy, sydd wedyn yn golygu bod fy nghrwyni yn wael, sydd eto yn fy nghrwyni o dan straen eto, ac wrth gwrs bydd y cylchred jyst yn cychwyn eto oherwydd y straen. Swnio'n syml? Mae'r byd yn newid. Trwy'r amser, rwyt ti'n newid gyda fo. Ac mae'n anodd dal fyny.
Felly, I le ydyn ni'n mynd o fan hyn, eh? Rydyn ni ddim yn mynd I ddiflannu. Dyn ni'n perthyn yn gilydd fel Laurel and Hardy neu Bill a Hillary. Ti'n meddwl allan ni gwneud hi I weithio? Y ffordd dwi'n gweld yw fel hyn, felly os wyt ti'n derbyn fi, na I derbyn ti ac yna allan ni dechrau goroesi. Falle nid y gelyn wyt ti, falle ti'n rhan ohona I fel anifal anwes hyll neu rhywbeth. Un dyn ni'n cofleidio ac yn caru mewn ffordd od. Ond dyna sut rydym ni yn mynd I oroesi.
That was fantastic, Chris. Thank you so much. And gyda mil mahagaf darach mach yn ymra agus diolch Arwel agus garmagat Pamela Tapleif Ule to all the panelists, and thank you to Chris for bringing a little bit of hope and joy to our lives, albeit via eczema and his challenges. I loved that. I think we're going to go to a break now. Brishakte, Phelim or Daniela, you can keep me right. And then please come back at 11:30 where we'd value all your opinions on the Guiding Principles session. See you then. Okay, bye. Chidi, Slan.
We'll be closing this webinar now. Thanks for checking out this panel, and thanks to all the panelists. If you want to talk to Chris in the Brishate, you can check it out from the WOVA app and join that room. We are going to go into the Guiding Principles session, where there's some wearing and shin, and that should be starting at 11:30. We're going to close this webinar in the next minute or so if people want to leave in your own time. Thanks very much to all the panelists once again. Mila Buchas. Grandma August.